The first thing I noticed when I stopped tilling was that my back stopped hurting. The second thing, a few weeks into that first spring, was more weeds. That second part is what sends most people back to the shed for the rototiller. They stop tilling, they get a flush of new growth they weren't expecting, and they write it off as a failure. What they don't realize is those weeds came from them. Every pass of a rototiller pulls dormant weed seeds up from depth, seeds that had been sitting 6, 8, 10 inches down, and drops them into the top 2 inches of soil where they can germinate. You weren't controlling your weed problem. You were reloading it once a year, every year. I stopped tilling 3 seasons ago. Here's what changed in the soil and why. The reason I tilled every spring was the same reason most people do. The bed had settled over winter, it was firm underfoot, and running a tiller through it was the fastest way to get a loose seed bed. Flip it over, rake it flat, plant into it. Done in an afternoon. The problem is that the looseness doesn't last. A few rains in and that freshly tilled bed settles back down, usually denser than before. The reason is soil aggregates. Those are the tiny clumps of clay, sand, and organic matter that bind together into crumb-like structures. The porous spaces between them are how water and roots move through the soil. Tilling breaks those aggregates apart. When they resettle, they pack tighter. The structure you had is gone. There's a second problem underneath that one. Running a tiller at the same depth every season creates what's called a tillage pan, a compacted layer right at blade depth, typically 6 to 8 inches down. The blade presses and polishes the soil at that line with every pass. Roots hit it. Water sits above it. You start wondering why your drainage is getting worse when you've been loosening the soil every year. The other thing tilling does is burn through your organic matter. You flip the bed over, expose the lower layers to oxygen, and the microbial community goes to work consuming that carbon. What looks like dark, rich soil after tillage is partly that organic matter being spent. You're drawing down the account with every pass. This is the part that changed how I think about the whole thing. Soil is a habitat, not a growing medium. Healthy, undisturbed soil contains more individual organisms in a single teaspoon than there are people on the planet. The ones that matter most for your plants aren't the bacteria. It's the fungi, specifically mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi form direct connections with plant roots. The plant sends them carbon, sugars produced through photosynthesis. In exchange, the fungi extend the plant's effective root system enormously. A single fungal hypha is roughly 1/60th the diameter of the finest root hair. They thread into spaces roots can't reach, pulling back phosphorus, water, zinc, and other nutrients. Some research puts the phosphorus contribution from mycorrhizal networks at around 80% of what a plant takes up over a growing season. Not 80% of a supplement, 80% of total phosphorus uptake. Tilling severs that network physically. The hyphae are cut by the blades. Rebuilding a functional mycorrhizal network takes most of a growing season, so your plants are operating without it for the year you tilled. You can fertilize heavily, and they still won't perform the way they would in undisturbed soil because the infrastructure for moving nutrients to the roots is broken. Then there are the earthworms. Earthworm casts, material that passes through their digestive system and gets deposited in the soil, contain 3 times more phosphorus and potassium than the surrounding soil, 4.5 times more calcium, and 2.5 times more nitrogen. They're not just aerating the ground, they're depositing fertility along every tunnel they dig. Tillage destroys those tunnel systems and desiccates earthworm eggs. Research from a 3-year field study published in 2025 confirmed earthworm populations recover more slowly than expected after switching to no-till. The transition takes 4 to 6 years to see full recovery. You don't get them back in one season. When you till every spring, you're resetting the clock on both populations every year. The soil never compounds. Back to those weeds in the first spring. Weed seeds in garden soil aren't mostly at the surface. They're distributed through the soil profile at various depths in what researchers call the seed bank. A study from Minnesota counted up to 130 million viable weed seeds per plowed acre. Most of them are too deep to germinate. They need the light and temperature variation at the soil surface. Tillage moves them up. A moldboard plow redistributes 97% of seeds in the top 4 centimeters from deeper layers. A rototiller does the same thing across its blade depth. Giant foxtail seeds survive 1 to 2 years near the surface. Buried deep, the same seeds can remain viable for 39 years. Lamb's quarters and pigweed can stay dormant for years before tillage brings them back into range. No-till doesn't eliminate weeds. What it stops is the annual restock. Seeds sitting at the surface are exposed to predation from ground beetles and birds and to drying out. After a few seasons without tillage, the surface seed bank runs down on its own. That first spring flush was the worst one. It got better from there. Year 1. More weeds in spring. The beds looked rough, not the clean, turned-over look I was used to. I laid cardboard over the paths, put down 3 inches of wood chip mulch, and top-dressed the planting beds with a few inches of compost. Planting felt slower. You're pushing through a mulch layer instead of dropping seeds into a clean, raked surface. Direct seeding was harder. Transplanting was fine. What changed by midsummer, the beds under mulch stayed consistently moister. In a dry stretch in July, my neighbors' tilled beds needed water every 2 days. Mine went 4 to 5 days between watering without the plants visibly struggling. That's the mulch holding surface moisture and the soil structure starting to hold what gets through instead of letting it run off. The mulched beds also stayed noticeably cooler through the hottest weeks. Tilled bare soil sitting in direct sun loses moisture fast and heats up to temperatures that stress roots. Under mulch, the surface temperature stays moderate and the moisture stays in. Year 2. The spring weed flush was shorter. It still came, but it cleared out in about 2 weeks instead of running in waves through the whole season. The earthworms were more numerous, not dramatically so, but visibly so. I could pick up a handful of soil and find 3 or 4 without really looking. Before no-till, finding 2 was a good day. The soil texture in the planting beds had started to change. The top few inches had more crumb structure, that loose, granular consistency that falls apart gently when you squeeze it, rather than clumping or crumbling to dust. Soil fungi produce a substance called glomalin that physically binds soil particles into aggregates. That texture is what glomalin and earthworm activity look like over a season of undisturbed soil. It's not dramatic, but it's different from what I had before. Year 3. Weed pressure is roughly half what it was in Year 1. I don't turn the beds in spring. I pull back the mulch layer, top dress with a few inches of compost, and plant into it. The beds are loose enough to push a finger in without resistance. I don't pre-water to soften the soil before transplanting the way I used to have to. The thing I can't measure but can observe, transplants establish faster. I've had fewer losses after planting out than in the tilled years. The fungal network that last season's crop supported is still in the soil when the new plants go in. New roots hit an existing system rather than bare mineral soil. One honest thing to say about spring, mulched beds do warm up more slowly than bare tilled ground. If you're in a short season climate and you're racing to get warm season crops in as early as possible, you'll feel that. I pull the mulch back from planting areas 2 weeks before planting to let the soil warm. It's an extra step that didn't exist before. None of this is free. Stopping tillage trades one set of work for another. Mulch is non-negotiable. A consistent 3-inch layer minimum on planting beds, more on paths. Without it, the surface dries and crusts over in dry weather and compacts in rain. The biology needs that mulch layer for moisture, temperature stability, and food as it breaks down. Getting enough mulch is the practical constraint most people underestimate in Year 1. Wood chips from a local arborist are often free. Ask any tree service if they'll drop a load. You need to stop walking in your beds. Foot traffic compacts soil. The poor structure you're trying to build is fragile in years 1 and 2, and a few passes across a wet bed will undo weeks of earthworm work. Defined paths that you never plant in and planting beds you never walk through, that's the layout you need from the start. And the first season is the hardest looking one. The beds are messier than a tilled garden. The mulch doesn't look as tidy. The spring weeds will make you doubt it. Year 2 is better. Year 3 is noticeably better. The soil doesn't reset to zero every spring. That's the actual trade you're making.